I welcome everyone. And if you turn with me to the letter of Paul to the Ephesians, we will read beginning with chapter 1, verse 1. The letter of Paul to the Ephesians, chapter 1. From Paul, one of King Yahshua's apostles through Yahweh's purpose, to the holy ones in Ephesus who are also loyal believers in King Yahshua. May Elohim, our Father, and the sovereign Yahshua, the King, give you grace and peace. Let us bless Yahweh, the Father of our sovereign Yahshua, the King. He has blessed us in the King with every spirit-inspired blessing in the heavenly realm. He chose us in him before the world was made, so as to be holy and irreproachable before him in love. He foreordained us for himself, to be adopted as sons and daughters through Yahshua the King. That's how he wanted it. And that's what gave him delight, so that the glory of his grace, the grace he poured on us in his beloved one, might receive its due praise. In the King and through his blood, we have deliverance. That is, our sins have been forgiven through the wealth of his grace which he lavished on us. Yes, with all wisdom and insight, he has made known to us the secret of his purpose, just as he wanted it to be, and set it forward in him as a blueprint for when the time was ripe. His plan was to sum up the whole cosmos in the King. Yes, everything in heaven and on earth in him. In him we have received the inheritance. We were foreordained to this, according to the intention of the one who does all things in accordance with the counsel of his purpose. This was so that we who first hoped in the King might live for the praise of his glory. In him you too, who heard the word of truth, the gospel of your salvation, and believed it, in him you were marked out with the Spirit of promise, the Holy One. The Spirit is the guarantee of our inheritance until the time when the people who are Yahweh's special possession are finally reclaimed and freed. This too is for the praise of his glory. Because of all this, and because I had heard that you are loyal and faithful to Yahshua the Master, and that you show love to all Yahweh's holy people, I never stop giving thanks for you as I remember you in my prayers. I pray that the Elohim of King Yahshua, our sovereign, the Father of glory, would give you in your spirit the gift of being wise, of seeing things people can't normally see, because you are coming to know him and to have the eyes of your inmost self open to Yahweh's light. Then you will know exactly what the hope is that goes with Yahweh's call. You will know the wealth of the glory of his inheritance in his holy people. And you will know the outstanding greatness of his power toward us who are loyal to him in faith, according to the working of his strength and power. This was the power at work in the King when Yahweh raised him from the dead and sat him at his right hand in the heavenly places, above all rule and authority and power and sovereignty, and above every name that is invoked, both in the present age and also in the age to come. Yes, Yahweh has put all things under his feet and has given him to the assembly as the head over all. The assembly is his body. It is the fullness of the one who fills all in all. Chapter 2. So where do you come into it all? Well, you were dead because of your offenses and sins. That was the road you used to travel, keeping in step with this world's present age. In step 2, with the ruler of the power of the air, the spirit that is even now at work among people whose whole lives consist of disobeying Yahweh. Actually, that's how all of us used to behave, conditioned by physical desires. We used to do what our flesh and our minds were urging us to do. What was the result? We too were subject to wrath in our natural state, just like everyone else. But when it comes to mercy, Yahweh is rich. He had such great love for us that he took us at the very point where we were dead through our offenses and made us alive together with the King. Yes, you are saved by sheer grace. He raised us up with him and made us sit with him in the heavenly places in King Yahshua. This was so that in the ages to come, he could show just how unbelievably rich his grace is, the kindness he has shown us in King Yahshua. How has this all come about? You have been saved by grace through faith. This doesn't happen on your own initiative. It's Yahweh's gift. It isn't on the basis of works, so though no one is able to boast. This is the explanation. Yahweh has made us what we are. Yahweh has created us in King Yahshua for the good works that he prepared ahead of time as the road we must travel. So then, remember this. In human terms, that is, in your flesh, you are Gentiles. You are the people whom the so-called circumcision referred to as the so-called uncircumcision. Circumcision, of course, being something done by human hands to human flesh. Well, once upon a time, you were separated from the king. You were detached from the community of Israel. You were foreigners to the covenants which contained the promise. There you were in the world with no hope and no Elohim. But now, in King Yahshua, you have been brought near in the king's blood. Yes, you who used to be a long way away. He is our peace, you see. He has made the two to be one. He has pulled down the barrier, the dividing wall that turns us into enemies of each other. He has done this in his flesh by abolishing the law with its commands and instructions. The point of doing all this was to create in him one new human being out of the two, so making peace. Yahweh was reconciling both of us to himself in a single body through the cross by killing the enmity in him. So the Messiah came and gave the good news. Peace had come. Peace, that is, for those you who are a long way away, and peace too for those who are close at hand. Through him, you see, we both have access to the Father in the one Spirit. This is the result. You are no longer foreigners or strangers. No, you are fellow citizens with Yahweh's holy people. You are members of Yahweh's household. You are built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with King Yahshua himself as the cornerstone. In him, the whole building is fitted together and grows into a holy temple in Yahweh. You too are being built up together in him into a place where Yahweh will live by the Spirit. Chapter 3. It's because of all this that I, Paul, the prisoner of King Yahshua, on behalf of you Gentiles, I'm assuming, by the way, that you've heard about the plan of Yahweh's grace that was given to me to pass on to you. You know, the secret purpose that Elohim revealed to me, as I wrote briefly just now. Anyway, when you read this, you'll be able to understand the special insight I have into the king's secret. This wasn't made known to human beings in previous generations, but now it's been revealed by the Spirit to Yahweh's holy apostles and prophets. The secret is this, that through the gospel, the Gentiles are to share Israel's inheritance. They are to become fellow members of the body along with them and fellow sharers of the promise in King Yahshua. This is the gospel that I was appointed to serve, in line with the free gift of Yahweh's grace that was given to me. It was backed up with the power through which Yahweh accomplishes his work. I am the very least of all Yahweh's people. However, he gave me this task as a gift, that I should be the one to tell the Gentiles the good news of the king's wealth no one could begin to count. My job is to make clear to everyone just what the secret plan is, the purpose that's been hidden from the very beginning of the world, and Elohim who created all things. This is it. That Yahweh's wisdom in all its rich variety was to be known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly places through the assembly. This was Yahweh's eternal purpose, and he's accomplished it in King Yahshua, our master. We have confidence and access to Elohim in him in full assurance through his faithfulness. So I beg you, don't lose heart because of my sufferings on your behalf. That's your glory. Because of this, I am kneeling down before the Father, the one who gives the name of family to every family that there is in heaven and on earth. My prayer is this, that he will lay out all the riches of his glory to give you strength and power through his Spirit in your inner being, that the King may make his home in your hearts through faith. That love may be your root, your firm foundation, and that you may be strong enough with all Yahweh's holy ones, to grasp the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the King's love, though actually it's so deep that nobody can really know it. So may Elohim fill you with all his fullness. So, to the one who is capable of doing far, far more than we can ask or imagine, granted the power which is working in us, to him be glory in the assembly and in King Yahshua to all generations and to the ages of ages. Amen. Chapter 4. So then, this is my appeal to you. Yes, it's me, the prisoner and the sovereign. You must live up to the calling you received. Bear with one another in love. Be humble, meek, and patient in every way with one another. Make every effort to guard the unity that the Spirit gives, with your lives bound together in peace. There is one body and one Spirit. You were, after all, called to one hope, which goes with your call. There is one sovereign, one faith, one baptism, one Elohim and Father of all, who is over all, through all, and in all. But grace was given to each one of us according to the measure the king used when he was distributing gifts. That's why it says, when he went up on high, he led bondage itself into bondage, and he gave gifts to people. When it says here that he went up, what this means is that he also came down into the lower place, that is the earth. The one who came down is the one who also went up, yes, above all the heavens, so that he might fill all things. So these were the gifts that he gave. Some were to be apostles, others prophets, others evangelists, and others pastors and teachers. Their job is to give Yahweh's people the equipment they need for their work of service, and so to build up the king's body. The purpose of this is that we should all reach unity in our belief and loyalty and in knowing Yahweh's Son. Then we shall reach the stature of the mature man measured by the standards of the king's fullness. As a result, we won't be babies any longer. We won't be thrown this way and that on a stormy sea, blown about by every gust of teaching, by human tricksters, by their cunning and deceitful scheming. Instead, we must speak the truth in love, and so grow up in everything into him, that is, into the King who is the head. He supplies the growth that the whole body needs, linked as it is and held together by every joint which supports it, with each member doing its own proper work. Then the body builds itself up in love. So this is what I want to say. I am bearing witness to it in the sovereign. You must no longer behave like the Gentiles, foolish minded as they are. Their understanding is darkened. They're cut off from Yahweh's life because of their deep seated ignorance, which springs from the fact that their hearts are hard. They have lost all moral sensitivity and have given themselves over to whatever takes their fancy. They go off greedily after every kind of uncleanness. But that's not how you learned the king. If indeed you did hear about him and were taught in him, in accordance with the truth about Yahshua himself. That teaching stressed that you should take off your former lifestyle, the old humanity. That way of life is decaying as a result of deceitful lusts. Instead, you must be renewed in the spirit of your mind, and you must put on the new humanity, which is being created the way Yahweh intended it, displaying justice and genuine holiness. Put away lies then. Each of you speak the truth with your neighbor, because we are members of one another. Be angry, but don't sin. Don't let the sun go down on you while you're angry. And don't leave any loophole for the devil. The thief shouldn't steal any longer, but should rather get on with some honest manual work so as to be able to share with people in need. Don't let any unwholesome words escape your lips. Instead, say whatever is good and will be useful in building people up, so that you will give grace to those who will listen. And don't disappoint Yahweh's Holy Spirit, the Spirit who put Yahweh's mark on you to identify you on the day of freedom. All bitterness and rage, all anger and yelling, and all blasphemy, put it all away from you with all wickedness. Instead, be kind to one another. Cherish tender feelings for each other. Forgive one another, just as Yahweh forgave you and the king. Chapter 5. So you should be imitators of Yahweh like dear children. Conduct yourselves in love, just as the Messiah loved us and gave himself for us as a sweet smelling offering and sacrifice to Elohim. As for fornication, uncleanness of any kind, or greed, you shouldn't even mention them. You are, after all, Yahweh's holy people. Shameful, stupid, or coarse conversations are quite out of place. Instead, there should be thanksgiving. You should know this, you see, no fornicator, nobody who practices uncleanness, no greedy person, in other words, an idolater, has any inheritance in the Messiah's kingdom or in Yahweh's. Don't let anyone fool you with empty words. It's because of these things, you see, that Yahweh's wrath is coming on people who are disobedient. So don't share in their practices. After all, at one time you were darkness, but now in Yahweh you are light. So behave as children of light. Light has its fruit, doesn't it? And everything that's good and just and true. Think through what's going to be pleasing to Yahweh. Work it out. So don't get involved in the works of darkness, which all come to nothing. Instead, expose them. The things they do in secret, you see, are shameful even to talk about. But everything becomes visible when it's exposed to the light, since everything that is visible is light. That's why it says, "Wake up, you sleeper. Rise up from the dead. The Messiah will shine on you." So take special care how you conduct yourselves. Don't be unwise, but be wise. Make use of any opportunity you have because these are wicked times we live in. So don't be foolish. Rather, understand what Yahweh's will is. And don't get drunk with wine. That way lies dissipation. Rather, be filled with the Spirit. Speak to each other in psalms and songs, spiritual songs, singing and chanting in your heart to Yahweh, always giving thanks for everything to Yahweh the Father in the name of our sovereign, Yahshua the Messiah. Be subject to one another out of reverence for the Messiah. Wives, be subject to your own husbands as to Yahweh. The man, you see, is the head of the woman, just as the Messiah too is head of the assembly. He is himself the savior of the body. But just as the assembly is subject to the Messiah, in the same way, women should be subject in everything to their husbands. Husbands, love your wives, as the Messiah loved the assembly and gave himself for it, so that he could make it holy, cleansing it by washing it with water through the word. He did this in order to present the assembly to himself in brilliant splendor, without a single spot or blemish or anything of the kind, that it might be holy and without blame. That's how husbands ought to love their own wives, just as they love their own bodies. Someone who loves his wife loves himself. After all, nobody ever hates his own flesh. He feeds it and takes care of it, just as the Messiah does with the assembly, because we are parts of his body. That's why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two become one flesh. The hidden meaning of this saying is very deep, but I am reading it as referring to the Messiah and the assembly. Anyway, each of you must love your wife as you love yourself, and the wife must see that she respects her husband. Chapter 6. Children, obey your parents in Yahweh. This is right and proper. Honor your father and your mother. This is the first commandment that comes with a promise attached, so that things may go well with you and that you may live a long life on earth. Fathers, don't make your children angry. Bring them up in the training and instruction of Yahweh. Slaves, obey your human masters with respect and devotion, with the same single-mindedness that you have toward Messiah. You must get on with your work, not only when someone is watching you, as if you were just trying to please another human being, but as slaves of the Messiah. Do Yahweh's will from your heart. Get on with your task with a kind and ready spirit, as if you were serving the master himself and not human beings. After all, you know that if anyone, slave or free, does something good, they will receive it back from the master. Masters, do the same to them. Give up using threats. You know, after all, that the master in heaven is their master and yours, and he is no respecter of persons. What else is there to say? Just this: be strong in Yahweh and in the strength of his power. Put on Yahweh's complete armor. Then you'll be able to stand firm against the devil's trickery. The warfare we're engaged in, you see, isn't against flesh and blood. It's against the leaders, against the authorities, against the powers that rule the world in this dark age, against the wicked spiritual elements in the heavenly places. For this reason, you must take up Yahweh's complete armor. Then, when wickedness grabs its moment, you'll be able to withstand, to do what needs to be done, and still to be on your feet when it's all over. So stand firm. Put the belt of truth around your waist. Put on justice as your breastplate. For shoes on your feet, ready for battle, take the good news of peace. With it all, take the shield of faith. If you've got that, you'll be able to quench all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is Yahweh's word. Pray on every occasion in the Spirit with every type of prayer and intercession. You'll need to keep awake and alert for this, with all perseverance and intercession for all Yahweh's holy ones, and also for me. Please pray that Yahweh will give me his words to speak when I open my mouth, so that I can make known loud and clear the secret truth of the gospel. That, after all, is why I'm a chained up ambassador. Pray that I may announce it boldly. That's what I'm duty bound to do. It's important that you should know how things are with me and what I'm up to. So our dear brother Tychicus will tell you about it. He is a loyal servant in Yahweh. I sent him to you with this in mind, so that you may know how things are with us and so that he may encourage your hearts. Peace be to the whole family and love with faith from Yahweh the Father and the sovereign Yahshua, the Messiah. Grace be with all who love our sovereign King Yahshua with a love that never dies. And that's the letter of Paul to the Ephesians. Let me just offer a few comments. So just a few brief comments on the letter to the Ephesians. So the letter to the Ephesians is one of the so-called prison epistles. And the prison epistles were written, most scholars believe, by Paul when he was imprisoned in Rome. I tend to agree with N.T. Wright and some others that think that he may have been imprisoned actually in Ephesus, but where exactly he was in prison is not really the point. The point is that he was under house arrest, and he would have been chained more than likely to a Roman Praetorian soldier. And so you look at Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Philemon. These are all prison epistles. And he had a lot of good advice, and he would send these letters, and then they would make the circuit and encourage people and answer some questions and try to continue to drive people moving forward in the faith. Ephesus was the main assembly that you would have found in what was in the ancient world known as Asia Minor. It's in the area of modern day Turkey, and it was a prominent assembly. So when you look at, for example, Revelation chapters 2 and 3, where you have the letters, you see that one of those letters was in fact written to Ephesus, and that starts in chapter 2 with verse 1. And of course, by this time, it's many, many years later, and we're talking maybe about 30 years later or more, potentially. And so they would have undergone a lot of different changes. But Ephesus was an important center, and it was because it was so metropolitan. You had many, many people that went through it. And one of the things it was especially known for was for the worship of Artemis, known to the Romans as Diana. So when you go over to Acts chapter 19, if you want to just turn there briefly, Acts 19, you see that Paul finally gets to Ephesus. He had wanted to go to some of the assemblies in Asia Minor earlier, but as you recall, the Spirit prevented him and instead redirected him to Europe, to Macedonia, and then Greece. But an assembly was finally formed right around Acts 19. It says, while Apollos, and actually you see that a few verses before in chapter 18 of Acts, Acts 18:18, Paul stayed on in Corinth for some time. Then he left the brothers and sisters and sailed for Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. And then down in verse 19, they arrived at Ephesus, where Paul left Priscilla and Aquila. He himself went into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. And then that's where he spent a lot of time, actually. And you see that for the most part brought out in Acts chapter 19. And this is where you find a riot that occurred. And in chapter 19, verse 23, about that time there arose a great disturbance about the way. A silversmith named Demetrius, who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought in a lot of business for the craftsmen there. He called them together along with the workers in related trades and said, "You know, my friends, that we receive a good income from this business. And you see and hear how this fellow Paul has convinced and led astray large numbers of people here in Ephesus and in practically the whole province of Asia. He says that gods made by human hands are no gods at all. There is danger not only that our trade will lose its good name, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be discredited, and the goddess herself, who is worshipped throughout the province of Asia and the world, will be robbed of her divine majesty." When they heard this, this is where I say like the Hulk, puny god, right? Anyway, when they heard this, they were furious and began shouting, "Great is Artemis," which is to say no Elohim at all. When they heard this, they were furious and began shouting, "Great is you know who of the Ephesians." Soon the whole city was in an uproar. The people seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia, and all of them rushed into the theater together. Paul wanted to appear before the crowd, but the disciples would not let him. Paul was pretty brave. He would have gone into the crowd anyway, but they prevented him from doing it. And you see a lot more that's written here about Paul's experience at Ephesus. So it's always a good idea to go back and look at whatever information that we have about the places where these things were preached, so that you can have some context, because these things don't happen in a vacuum, right? So you learn to understand the letters better when you understand the history, when you understand the geography, when you understand the doctrinal importance as compared to what's going on around them. You see so much in the book of Acts that's tied into temples, right? So I just read that on purpose in Acts chapter 18 to show you the big hullabaloo that was going on with regard to the temple of Artemis, which is a false mighty one, of course, in a false temple. So when you look at that and you compare it to the Paul's letter to the Ephesians, you see the contrast between this false worship of Artemis. And by the way, the worship of Artemis was considered to be one of the later in history, of course, was considered to be one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. All right, so it was a big deal. It wasn't some little local thing. People came from all over the world to worship there. It was a place of pilgrimage for a lot of pagans. So it's a big deal, is my point. So when you look at what Paul is saying, he's talking about the true temple, right, as compared to this false temple. There's a great contrast there, and there's this great contrast between the believer's way of doing things and the Gentile way of doing things. And Paul is essentially saying throughout this letter that we have to rejoice because Yahweh has opened eyes, right? Not just Jews, but also Gentiles. He's opened the eyes of Jewish people to understand the greater role that the rest of humanity has in Yahweh's grace and mercy, right? Because during Paul's time, so many people who followed Judaism were very anti-Gentile, okay, in many ways. So Paul is essentially saying to the Jewish people, you need to open your eyes because Yahweh has allowed Gentiles into his fold. And then he's saying to Gentiles, okay, you are now, whereas at one time you were separate from Elohim and you followed deities that were no Elohim at all, right? Now you have an opportunity to follow the Most High. So you have to turn away from the things that you used to do, and you now need to begin to follow this way with everything that entails, right? So, but all together, whether Jew or Gentile, all together, you become one new thing altogether. So it's not about being a Jew in the sense of keeping the Jewish faith as it was known up to that time, and it's not about being a Gentile, carefree, doing whatever you want, or worse, following pagan practices, but it's about one brand new thing in Messiah that you're all supposed to be following and that you're all supposed to be working towards, the assembly, right? What Christianity refers to as the church, what we, prefer to use the term assembly, the assembly, which is a completely new thing that's based upon the thread of worship from the beginning up until present. So in effect, what's happened is that a temple that is not constrained by brick and mortar, right? A temple that's not based upon material things built by human hands, a spiritual temple is being built with Jewish people, Gentiles. In other words, the whole world is fulfilling what was promised to Abraham, right? Yahweh's fulfilling what was promised to Abraham for the entire world. So Paul is saying that the things that were promised from the very beginning have now come to fruition, right? So if you go to Genesis chapter 12, Yahweh said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you." And then that is, that covenant is further elaborated upon in Genesis 15, but you also see it in the prophets, you see it in the Psalms, and eventually it's fulfilled beginning in Paul's time up until the present day. So Paul is reminding them throughout the book of this plan, right? This mystery, right? Now, he translates it a little bit differently, the secret plan, right? But it's a mystery. And when we think about a mystery in our current culture, we tend to think of something that is not known, right? This is something that you kind of secret away. But that's not the meaning of the biblical term in the Greek, mysterion. So, and he's alluding to this in his translation, which is why he translated it the way that he did. So it's something that is actually at one time used to be hidden from people's eyes. Like people's eyes were veiled, but now that veil has been removed, and people, because of Yahshua's death and resurrection, and now we are able to see his truth, and we're able to see that plan coming to fruition, which is, and what is that plan? That plan is to bring heaven and earth together, right? This is what you see over in verse 10 of chapter 1. It says to be let's start with 1:8. With all wisdom and understanding, he made known to us, and I'm reading from the NIV now, he made known to us the mystery of his will. Okay. He made known to us the mystery of his will. And in this translation, it says, he made known to us the secret of his purpose. Okay. The mystery of his will, according to his good pleasure, which he purposed in Messiah, to be put into effect when the times reach their fulfillment, to bring unity to all things in heaven and on earth under Messiah. To bring unity to all things in heaven and on earth on the Messiah. And he repeats versions of that throughout this. Again, this concept of uniting heaven and earth once again. So in the same way that layer, that veil is removed in the temple on Yom Kippur, right? Because you have the separation between the holy place and the Holy of Holies. The Holy of Holies representing the most profound center, right? Which it would be Yahweh's throne room in heaven. In fact, it's connecting heaven and earth, you see, in a spiritual sense. So this is what is happening in a broader sense with the actual heavens and earth. This connection, this this unification of heaven and earth, which was begun when Yahshua died and was resurrected. Okay. So he's reminding them of this plan. And because you have this greater plan to have unity between heaven and earth, may your will be done, right? Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name, recognition of his sovereignty. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That's that unification of heaven and earth. And he's describing it here. And he's saying that this was Yahweh's plan all along. And people didn't realize that. But through Yahshua's death and resurrection, we now have our eyes open and can see that. That veil in the temple would have been lifted. And symbolically, metaphorically, that veil also that separated us was also lifted, you see. And interestingly enough, there's something else that is lifted. There's another, this is a whole book, a whole letter, right? But it's a book, we can call it a book, where you have this distinction, these distinctions that are being obliterated, right? So whereas before you had a distinction between heaven and earth, this kind of apart, now they're being brought together through Yahshua's death and resurrection. And Jews and Gentiles are also being brought together. It's all about unification. It's all about unity. If you think about, for example, to get an idea of the rejoicing that Paul feels, it's almost like, I don't know, for younger people, you might not appreciate this as much, but those of you who are, about my age or maybe a little younger, you might remember when the Berlin Wall came down in the 80s, right? Late 80s, early 90s, I guess. Was it 90, 89, 90, around there? If you remember what it was like before, right? Where you had the former Soviet Union, the darkness, spiritually speaking, right? The darkness under which people behind the Iron Curtain felt. And then when that wall came down, there was a spirit of freedom all throughout the world, not just in that part of the world, but throughout the world, because it's almost as if a spiritual force was dispelled. An evil spiritual force was dispelled when that wall came down. That wall was symbolic of a greater spiritual reality, right? And this is kind of what Paul is talking about here in a similar fashion, that you've had this separation between heaven and earth because of the sin of Adam. But now through the victory of the second Adam, you have an opportunity to have unification once again, heaven and earth unified once again, with that veil of separation removed. And it's kind of, it's emblematic of that you have this wall of separation that existed between Jews and Gentiles. You see, it's all part of it. It's all, just go to chapter 2, right? He's speaking to the Gentile parts of Ephesus, because they had both Jews and Gentiles. And he says, you were dead because of your offenses and sins. That was the road you used to travel. You used to do things completely differently, right? We used to do what our flesh and our minds were urging us to do. And we were subject to wrath in our natural state. What is this idea of wrath? This idea of wrath, people just think about it as Yahweh being some vengeful Elohim that's ready to fling down, hurl down, thunderbolts and stuff. That's not the vision of Yahweh that Paul is trying to convey. He's speaking about an Elohim who hates injustice, right? He's not speaking about some capricious, old man sitting up in heaven, on watching everybody and waiting to just come down like a hammer. He's talking about it's prophetic language. It's wrath of Elohim. It's prophetic language that indicates that Yahweh is going to set things right. He's a holy Elohim who cannot stand impurity. He cannot abide impurity for himself or for his creation. So he's going to restore creation to an Edenic state. He's going to restore it to what it was always meant to be, to the potential for which he created it. And man was part of that creation. And he's going to restore man to the potential for which he was created, you see. So this healing of the breach between Jew and Gentile is emblematic, is symbolic of that greater healing that's going to be done for the entire world, where Yahweh's wrath is meant to eliminate injustice, to eliminate pain and suffering, and to bring healing to the land. And it starts with his own special creation, man, you see. So when you look at, for example, over at, and I'll read from the NIV because it may be more familiar language to you. When you look, for example, at verse 11, therefore remember that formerly you were Gentiles by birth and called uncircumcised by those who call themselves the circumcision. And then down in verse 13, but now in Messiah Yahshua, you who were once far away, the Gentiles, have been brought near by the blood of Messiah, you see. For he himself, Yahshua, is our peace, who has made the two groups one, unity, unification, and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by setting aside in his flesh with its command, the law with its commands and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace, and in one body to reconcile both of them, one body physically through his death and resurrection, and metaphorically, right? The body of, as in the body of Messiah, right? And in one body to reconcile both of them to Yahweh through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility, the hostility that was between them, right? So when you look at that concept of the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, so people think, and they look at those verses and they think that this is the doing away of the law, of the Torah. I don't see that at all. What's happening there is that there used to be in the temple precincts, there was literally, quite literally, a wall at a certain point of the court. And beyond that point, the Gentiles could no longer proceed. So think about this. Gentiles who were convinced of, somehow they heard the message of salvation, right? Somehow they heard, well, not even the message of salvation just yet, right? They would have heard what was being taught by the Jews. And some of them would have been what are considered to be, the term that's used in the New Testament quite often is Elohim fearers, right? They would have been Elohim fearers wanting to know more, and they'd come to worship because they're convicted of worship, but yet they weren't allowed to go full force. They weren't allowed to play full out. They were literally treated as second-class citizens. They couldn't even go beyond this wall in the temple precincts. And Paul is saying that's never going to do, and that was never Yahweh's intention. That wall is removed. And by the way, I've seen a piece of that wall. You know, there was a display in New York City one time, and I saw a part of that. There was a sign, an actual sign that said that Gentiles cannot pass this particular location, this particular section here, and that was symbolically removed because Paul says that doesn't exist. So Gentiles can freely go as deeply as the Jews go into the temple. And that's symbolic of even a greater thing, right? It's metaphorical for the temple that Yahweh is building, and which consists of each one of us, every worshiper, right? Verse 19 of chapter 2, consequently, you Gentiles are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens, you see, with Yahweh's people, and also members of his household, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with Messiah Yahshua himself as the chief cornerstone. So he's speaking in metaphor, right? Yahshua is the chief cornerstone. The cornerstone, when you're engaged in a building project, is the primary stone by which everything else is measured and angled to make sure, right? If the cornerstone is off, the whole building is going to be off. The cornerstone is the first one that you lay down, because then you use it as the standard by which every other stone is put in place. So if the cornerstone is skewed, if the cornerstone is not properly laid, the rest of the building is going to be a mess. But the cornerstone is Yahshua himself, and that's taken straight out of one of the Psalms, one of the prophets, I believe. I'd have to go and check the particular prophetic passage. But the cornerstone is Yahshua, and then the rest of the foundation is the apostles and prophets, right? Because they laid the foundation literally for us in terms of the faith. But then it says in verse 21, in him, in Yahshua, the whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple in Yahweh. And in him, you too, that's you, that's me, you too are being built together to become a dwelling in which Yahweh lives by his Spirit. This is why I don't get excited about talk about the temple being rebuilt, right? You have some religious groups out there, some Christian groups included, that they get excited about, well, the third temple, this is I don't care about the third temple, because that the third temple doesn't mean anything for us anymore. You understand that? The only reason I get any kind of excitement about a third temple is because of prophetic things that are going to happen in conjunction with the powers that be out there trying to build a third temple. But as far as our worship towards Yahweh, we don't need a temple. You understand that, right? There is no more necessity for a physical temple for us to worship Yahweh. Yes, there's going to be a physical temple in the kingdom. We know that from Ezekiel, but that's not for you and me. That is a teaching tool, and that's a message for another day. That is a teaching tool for those who are going to be going through that millennial period, right? Much like we've had teaching tools in the course of our humanity, right? But as far as us, we are the temple. Please understand that. Every single one of us constitutes a living, breathing stone, right? This is what you see over in let me find it for you here. In First Peter chapter 2, verse 4, as you come to him, the living stone, Yahshua, rejected by humans, but chosen by Yahweh and precious to him, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood. What does the priesthood do, by the way? The priesthood teaches, right? Priests teach. So we're meant to be teachers. Teachers of what? Teachers of Yahweh's way of life throughout the earth, you see. You also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to Yahweh through Yahshua Messiah. For in Scripture it says, see, I lay a stone in Zion, a chief and precious cornerstone, and the one who trusts in him will never be put to shame. That's the passage I was quoting to you before about the cornerstone. It's from Isaiah 28:16. Now to you who believe, this stone is precious, but to those who do not believe, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. That's Psalm 118:22. And a stone that causes people to stumble, and a rock that makes them fall. Isaiah 8:14, right? They stumble because they disobey the message, which is also what they were destined for. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, Yahweh's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of Elohim. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. And on and on we could go. And that's absolutely consistent with what you find here in Ephesians. So there's all this temple language that's described here, because the temple, you understand, was where heaven and earth were reunited, right? As I've explained this many times, it was the pattern that was shown to Moses on the Mount. It was the pattern in the tabernacle and eventually to the temple, and then the first temple, then the second temple, and extended to the spiritual temple, that it is a pattern showing the way back to Eden, the way back to the intimate connection between Yahweh and mankind that existed from the very beginning. So you see in verse 22, back to Ephesians 2:22, and in him you too are being built together to become a dwelling in which Yahweh lives by his Spirit. But there's also language throughout. In the first chapter, you see a description, and it says in verse 22 of chapter 1, and Elohim placed all things under his feet, Yahshua, right? Well, let me just go back a little bit. Verse 18, chapter 1:18. I pray that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened, in order that you may know the hope to which he has called you, the riches of his glorious inheritance in his holy people, that's us, and his incomparably great power for us who believe. That power, and power is very important to Paul, because he's talking about the power of Yahweh as compared to the power of the world, right? That power is the same, verse 19, as the mighty strength he exerted when he raised Messiah from the dead. So he always goes back to the resurrection, Paul does, right? Because the resurrection was the ultimate display of Yahweh's power. So he's always going to go back to that as the prime example of what Yahweh can do, what Yahweh will do, what Yahweh has done. By raising Yahshua bodily from the dead, he has raised corruption into incorruption. He has raised something that was decaying into something that, well, potentially decaying, because Yahshua didn't decay, but he was raising, because he was exemplary, right? But he was raising something that was emblematic of decay into something that was pure, just like he will do for all mankind. He's taking that which is deteriorating, that which is decaying, and raising it to the wholeness and perfection that it's supposed to be, that it's always expected to be. Just in the same way that morally, he wants us to stay away from things that cause decay, from things that cause deterioration, right? And he's using it with temple language. He's using it with sacrificial language. Why? Because the sacrifices were what purified, right? Through the blood. What does that mean? Remember, we talked not too long ago about this? The blood is representative of life. The animal's blood represented life, just like eventually his ultimate sacrifice, Yahshua, his blood represents life. And when the animals' offerings were offered, what happened? The blood would cover over, symbolically, metaphorically, it was substituted to cover over everything that smelled of death, if you want to put it very vulgarly, right? Very bluntly. In the tabernacle and in the temple, death was vanquished, you understand? Anything that smelled of death, not only the human beings, right? The decay and deterioration in the flesh of humankind because of the fall of Adam, but also even the temple elements and the tabernacle elements, the furniture and all the things there, they also had to be sprinkled with blood, right? Because all of those things were subject to decay. All of it was subject to decay. And the only thing that could overcome that is the blood, because the blood is representative of life, and it wipes out the stain and the stench of death, you understand? And then, of course, the ultimate sacrifice was Yahshua the Messiah. Through his blood, it was through an innocent, right? Death was completely vanquished, and he had a complete victory. And that language is being brought out here, right? So Ephesians, continuing to read here, 1:19, and his incomparably great power for us who believe. That power is the same as the mighty strength he exerted when he raised Messiah from the dead and seated him at his right hand in the heavenly realms, far above all rule and authority, power and dominion, and every name that is invoked, not only in the present age, but also in the one to come. And Elohim placed all things under his feet and appointed him to be head over everything, Yahshua, over everything for the assembly, which is his body, the fullness of him who fills everything in every way. So a couple of things that are here, and I wish I had time to go through everything else, but I obviously don't. But he's saying that he raised Yahshua, right? That power he used to raise Yahshua from the dead and to subject everything under Yahshua, to raise him far above all rule and authority, power and dominion. Where do you see that? You see that further described in Ephesians 6, right? So when you go to Ephesians 6, it says in verse 12, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. It's the same language, right? So the power of Yahweh vanquishes all the powers of the air, right? What is that? That's the power behind the throne, so to speak. Satan is called the prince of this world, right? This is what we're talking about, that there are forces in the world to the present day, from the time that Adam fell until the present day, there are evil forces in the world that manifest themselves in different ways and that compete for the hearts of men, you understand? And those forces are dominating this earth. And whenever Yahweh was in action, those forces would get they would holler and reach crescendos, because they're not going to go down without a fight. And even with Yahshua's death, right? You still have this this battle, this spiritual battle that Paul describes in Ephesians 6 that we're engaged in into the present day, where these forces that exist in the earth, and they manifest themselves how? Through social forces, through political forces, through economic forces, through idolatrous forces, religious, right? Pagan religions, etc. All those forces exist in this world as we speak, but they're all being vanquished. And this is why it's like death throes, right? Because they know that they're defeated. And that Yahweh placed all things under Yahshua's feet and appointed him to be head over everything for the assembly, which is his body, which we now know is also a temple that is where heaven and earth come together. And we as his body are his arms and his eyes and his feet and his influence in the earth to overcome the powers of darkness. This is why when we get afraid, even what's happening in our country here in the United States next week, so many of us are afraid of what's going to happen. And I'm saying to you, we don't have to be afraid, because no matter what happens, Yahweh is in control. And the things that are going to occur because Yahweh allows them so. Just like Yahshua told Pilate, right? He said, you wouldn't have any authority were not given to you from above. So whatever happens next week, take heart. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it goes in the worst imaginable way possible from the perspective of humanity. There will be a lot of hand-wringing next week. And I understand. I feel it too, because I'm undergoing things and you're undergoing things, and we're all dealing with things because we're in the soup, right? But always keep in mind, even as we're going through the things in the soup, keep in mind that there's one who's stirring the soup, who has control over the whole business. And ultimately, he knows exactly how these things are going to play out. And there's not one single thing that's going to happen next week or otherwise that Yahweh is not aware of. And I hope that that's something that we find comforting. It says here in verse 23, which is his body, the fullness of him who fills everything in every way. What is that? It's temple language. Who fills everything in every way. It's the description of the cloud filling the tabernacle. It's a description of the cloud filling the temple to the point where the priests could not even enter because the thickness of the cloud and the holiness was so strong, you see. That's what it's referring to when it's talking about the fullness of him who fills everything in every way. It's temple language. And it's on, and so much more I could give. But the only other thing I'll say, and then I'll bring it to a close, I really do want to keep it to an hour. We've been going about an hour. Ephesians 4-6, once he explains in chapters 1-3, the background and the bigger picture in terms of Yahweh's plan, then he starts giving specific counsel about how we should live as examples of that body, as stones, right? You always got to read this in context. As living stones, building a holy temple, we're supposed to live with holy lives. We're supposed to live with justice, and we're supposed to live with holiness. We're supposed to live as ambassadors, as examples to people out there of what Yahweh's kingdom is supposed to be like. The assembly is Yahweh's, his model to the world of what this world is supposed to be like, of what it's going to be like. That's why when you look throughout history, you see that that Bible believers have been the ones for every major innovation that exists out there in the guise of Christianity. And of course, there's a lot of paganism that's been mixed in there because of the plan of the evil one. But it is Christians that have changed the world in every area. In medicine, in science. It sounds weird because of the way people talk against Christianity, but in terms of science, medicine, social innovations. Okay, the book that you hold in your hands, that's a believer innovation, right? I'm not crazy about using, anyway, that's for another day. It is a believer's innovation. Why? Because it was the codex, which is what this is called technically, this form, instead of a scroll of books, a codex was created for the reading of the Bible. That's what it was created for. Okay, and that's just one example, but there are all kinds of innovations in everything that you could think of. Why? Because it was Yahweh's will that his people would show the world what it means for his kingdom to be on earth. So when you look, and by the way, this is a very good book. I would highly recommend to you. I read it years ago. as part of a men's group, and I'm so glad I did, because now, as I'm learning some of these things, I'm able to recall it. So this book is by a pastor. His name is D. James Kennedy. Some of you may have heard of him, D. James Kennedy. And the name of the book is "What If Jesus Had Never Been Born?" What if Jesus had never been born? The gist of this book is exactly what I'm describing. It describes in every major area the innovations that have occurred for humanity's betterment through Christianity. Now, we can debate from here to tomorrow, well, why specifically Christianity, right? And with a lot of the admixtures of doctrines that have gone off the rails, whatever. That's not, that's another thing, okay? But it is a fact that the inheritors of the biblical tradition, okay, were the ones who have brought forth, okay, they have problems of their own with regard to doctrines, but it is a fact that it is those inheritors that have been responsible for every major innovation that has resulted in the betterment of mankind, because of the way that they were taught by their master to think with regard to love, with regard to the underdog, with regard to the poor. For example, the concept of looking out for the poor to make sure that everyone's fed, that everyone's educated, that is a messianic innovation. It was not something. It doesn't mean that other people didn't care about that, but it means as a whole, as an institution, people were pretty much left to themselves historically. But those ideas about everyone deserving education, everyone doing this, everyone doing, that's an innovation that came as a result of what has come to be known in the world as Christianity. Go read that book and see if it doesn't impress you and if it doesn't change your paradigm about certain things. So my point is that us, as part of that tradition coming into the present day, we are supposed to also be ambassadors of that truth, shining that light into the world. We're not supposed to hide the lamp under the table, right? We're not supposed to let the salt become tasteless, right? We're supposed to season with the salt. We're supposed to, so because of the things that we see out there, we shy away. We tend to shrink because we think that is almost an element of shame in so many people, because you're afraid to be known as a Bible believer, right? And I'm not going to ask you how you feel about it. You alone know that question, right? I know how I feel about it, but I'm not going to ask you how you feel about it. You have to think about that one and do a little soul searching for yourself, right? But the bottom line is, how do you feel about your faith? Do you care if people know what you believe and who you believe in? And by care, do you care? I mean, does it matter to you if someone knows that you're a believer? Will it, will it cause you some pain, or will it bring up vulnerabilities that you'd rather not have brought up? I understand. I get it if that's the case. But we all need to rethink that, right? Because Yahshua said that those who are ashamed of him and his word are not going to be looked upon with a lot of favor, right? Because we're going to be hiding, because the salt will lose its flavor, because we won't get out there and make our word known. And I'm not talking about having a formal ministry, right? I'm not talking about, going out on social media and then going, putting all kinds of messages just to, hey, look who I am, look what I, no. Do it with your life. Do it in your work. Do it in how you interact with people at school, right? It's how you live. It's the witnesses that you have personally in the day to day. It doesn't have to be a formal ministry. You don't have to make a show of it. You don't have to go on street corners with big signs saying believe, right? You got to do it in the ways in which Yahweh gives you in your day to day action. But when you have conversations with people and they ask you the reason for your faith, it's like Peter said, be ready to give an answer, right? And don't shrink back from it. Don't act like if you don't believe what you believe. Well, I believe in being a good person. Don't be a cop. Don't go to a cop out. Tell them why. Because you represent the king, King Yahshua, the one rightful king. Let me tell you, in Paul's day, I'll end with this. In Paul's day, for him to be out there talking about King Yahshua, right? And declaring that Yahshua is king, that he took his life in his hands every time he did that. Because for him to say that Yahshua was king meant who wasn't? Caesar. And Caesar, his arm was very long in the day of Paul. And eventually, time ran out for him, right? Because at least traditionally, we know that we're told that Paul was killed. He was executed under the hand of Nero, and I see no reason to doubt that. But Paul was ready because he believed, he knew, and he understood that the true and rightful king, Yahshua, had already had the victory. And he was ready to proclaim it everywhere he did. And he felt that it was our responsibility to proclaim it as well. And this is what so much of his letters convey, including what you're seeing here in the book of Ephesians. So lots more that can be said, but I'm going to leave it at that.